And the interesting part about it is that this revolt actually happened like 3 years before the Reformation even started. This revolt ended in about 1514. And of course, like Martin Luther is actually going to do his 95 Theses, start printing them and actually issuing them out in 1517, right? So the thing and the reason why I always like to bring this up is a lot of people are like, oh, Mr. Terry, were peasant revolts now a thing after the Reformation? No, peasant revolts have been a thing for quite some time, right? Peasants are always looking for a way to rectify the situation and the unjust situation that feudalism is putting onto them, right? Feudalism is messed up. Feudalism is unfair. I was talking to Gianna Rodriguez actually at one point in class, I believe, and I told her, I was like, yeah, like feudalism's not going to end, or was it Katie Scuderi? I can't remember who was talking to me in S period about it, but literally, like, in general, the Russian government isn't going to outlaw feudalism until 1861. So literally, we're going to have hundreds of years of peasant inequality, and they're always going to be violent revolts and things like that. But the interesting thing about this violent revolt, the German Peasants War of 1525, is it's now going to try and use religion, and it's going to try and cite scripture to use in its efforts to try and actually win new rights, win more things for the peasants, and also win over the governments and try to have a more stable place in society, right? So the thing about it is, the way it all started is in 1525. Let's kind of give ourselves a little bit of a base. Martin Luther is on the run. He's being hidden by all these different German princes, right? Interesting little thing. He also is hiding, but he's still writing, and he's going by a new nickname. He actually is going by this goofy little nickname like Junker Joe or something like that. He has a pen name that he's writing in secret underneath, right? And the German princes are having all of his stuff printed, and they're sending it out. For any Bridgerton fans in the house that are watching this right now, it's kind of like Lady Pennywise or whatever. Not Pennywise. That's that creepy clown. Yeah, definitely not that. So, no, the, Lady Whistledown from Bridgerton and stuff like that. It's kind of like he was writing this whole little pen name thing. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is that he is living under, lock and key, right, with those German peasants. Charles V is trying to find him. We've got some major political disruptions going on. But in 1525, while Martin Luther is hiding, while Zwingli is doing things in Switzerland, while the Reformation is growing, peasants are going to be outraged because of crop failures and rising rents, right? So the German princes that are hiding Martin Luther are upping the amounts of rent on their feudal, their feudal lands. The vassals have to pay more. The peasants and the serfs now have to pay more. But the problem is that literally the serfs' crops are dying. There are weather patterns that were coming through Germany during this time that were destroying a large number of crops. And while the rents are rising, the peasants didn't have anything to pay for, right? And so they go up to the princes and they're like, do you realize how unfair this is? Do you realize what you're doing to us? You're starving our families out. And so at this moment, leaders of this peasant revolt were like, wait a minute. What if we wrote to Martin Luther, right? So they wrote to Martin Luther and they tried to get Martin Luther on their side and they cited scripture and they tried to say all these different ideas. They were like, look, Martin Luther, it says that in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the things that you're telling us to read, that no man is above one another. No man is better than any other. And Luther originally came out and was like, you know what, guys? You're right. You are right. No man is really inherently better than anybody else, and every man should do their best to help out their fellow man. Help thy neighbor, right? Luther originally supported this, but then the biggest thing about it in general is that the princes are going to go up to Luther and be like, do you know who's hiding you? Do you know who's helping you? Do you know who's keeping you alive? And then all of a sudden, Luther flipped on the peasants and then talked down on them and said that they should be literally taken out like dogs in the streets, right? What is going on right now? 75,000 people we estimate were killed when the nobles crushed this rebellion. Because as the rebellion started, the peasants had massive victories, right? They started taking over all these different areas of different German principalities and stuff like that. And they began this massive movement over the entirety of the German lands. But after Martin Luther comes out, talks down about the movement, and the other German princes get involved and they show up with very, very large armies, the German Peasants' Rebellion would be crushed. Literally crushed, and 75,000 people would lose their lives, right? Now, it's just important to note that the German peasants were citing scripture, that, of course, they tried to appeal to Luther, and then Luther is going to, kind of turn his back on them, right? Now, the interesting thing about it as well is look at what's going on. Literally, the Reformation is seriously like a can of worms.
God, can open worms everywhere?
Haha, I remember this time. It is like a can of worms, though, right? Thank you, Chandler. It is like a can of worms. Literally, it's been opened and it's everywhere, and there is no putting this back in the bottle, right? So it's also beginning to spiral out of control. The Reformation is getting to the point where it's wildly starting to grow in a lot of different directions, and you're going to see the birth of these people called radical reformers, right? So now you've got Lutherans that are popping up because, of course, he's starting, like Martin Luther started the Lutheran Church, right? You've got Zwingli followers popping up in Switzerland. You've got other followers. The Hussites are still out in Bohemia still for a little while. They haven't all died yet, right? But they're still kind of meandering around. But you've got also, during this time period, you're getting very, very close to this dude named John Calvin popping up and doing a lot of his work, right? So you've got these different reformers that are going to be very key players in this whole thing. But then you've got these little teeny tiny little reformers, and they were known as radical reformers, right? Now, write this down or jot this down real quick. Radical reformers can be best associated with the thoughts and ideas of Zwingli, right? The idea of teaching the Bible from A to Z, right? Using the entire New Testament, going by what the Bible says. But the thing about it is these radical reformers began to break their church with secular authorities, right? These radical reformers began to be like, hey, we are not going to pay your taxes because you say that we should. We are trying to be closer to God, right? These radical reformers started trying to start up their own communities. They started trying to basically like secede from other parts of Europe. And another big thing about these radical reformers is that they were devoutly pacifist, right? A lot of them were pacifists. Now, a handful of them were very, very violent. I'm just giving you a heads up. Like, there's this thing called the Munster Rebellion and stuff like that that might pop up on an AP test, but I highly, 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 highly doubt it, because if they're digging into the Munster Rebellion, like, this is just one of those random things that I know about, right? Now, the biggest thing about it, though, in general, is most of your radical reformers are pacifist. Most of them want to break away from most countries and kind of have little, like, insulated communities. Most of them don't even want to have to listen to their government anymore. So this is going to dramatically change the tide of... Okay, come, Maria, hold on one second. Hi, sweetheart. I'm good. I'm flipping. Can I call you right back? Okay, love you. Bye. But anyway, big thing about it, though, in general, all right? So he wants to break the church from secular authority. Not he, but the radical reformers want to break it from secular authorities, do all this different stuff. And then there's one more key element that you should know. Radical reformers began to shake the foundation of cultural Europe because they believed in adult baptism, all right? Write that down, adult baptism. The radical reformers are going to pop up, and they're going to start believing that only people who are adults and who have understandable mind and body, and understandable reading of the gospel, and understandable reading of the New Testament can truly take in God's presence and be baptized, right? So they believed that infant baptism was wrong, and they believed that you should be baptized as an adult after you've formed a coherent mind, right? Well, the thing about it is, out of all these different things, it is going to shake the foundations of Europe, because Anabaptists is what they're called, started popping up, right? Anna as in referring to later in life, right? Anabaptists show up, and they've got all these different little groups, right? You got Mennonites, because they were started by this guy named Menon. You got Hutterites that were started by this guy named Hutter. You got the Amish that you've probably heard of before, or the Amish, the Pennsylvania Dutch, that don't get started up until way, 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 way later. But I always like to bring them up on this list so you have a better understanding of the people that we're talking about, right? The Amish literally are not governed by the government inside of the United States. They actually are governed by their own set of rules and laws, right? So the thing about it in general is Mennonites, Hutterites, Amish people are also devoutly pacifists. They do not fight in wars, right? So this is going to anger the ruling bodies of all these different groups in Europe, and other little tiny subgroups later on are going to be Quakers and Baptists in the modern way. I was raised in a Baptist church when I was younger. I had to choose to be baptized if I wanted to be, right around the time you hit about like 13, 14 years old, right? So the biggest thing about it in general, though, is all these little subgroups of Anabaptists are popping up, and basically then begins an extermination campaign. You've got a massive amount of deaths being put on these small communities because even the Lutherans didn't like them. And then also the Catholics didn't like them. And so you literally can see right here a Dutch Anabaptist who is not even being burned at the stake, but who is strapped to a ladder and then pushed up and then and then pushed into a bonfire and executed, right? You've got literally right over here a massive group of Anabaptists who are being burned at the stake for refusing to fight in wars, refusing to work with the Catholic government, and wanted to start their own community. communities, and they're literally being hoisted off the stakes after being burned to death by this figure right here with a pitchfork, right? You literally had this one French noble, or French king, I believe, I think it might have been Francis I that said this, that literally went around and said, oh, they want to get a second baptism when they're adults? How about this? If they keep it up, I'll give them their third baptism, which means to drown them, right? That is insanity. So the Anabaptists were popping up, and they are going to stay around, right? Like, they are going to kind of keep existing, but they're going to have to start existing in secret, which is a very, very important little thing that you need to understand. So the Mennonites, the Hutterites, the Amish, the Quakers, and Baptists, they do kind of still exist to this day, but they did have to keep their heads down and had to try and avoid the massive amount of, like, actual, like, violence that was being enacted onto them because of their radical reformative ideas, right? So going into it as well, you're then going to see large-scale warfare popping up, all right? So the religious wars in Switzerland and Germany are very good examples of this different violence that's popping up during the Reformation period, right? So first and foremost, you got to understand that when we're looking at this entire thing, German princes are clinging to the ideas of Luther, right? Luther is writing in secret. He's marrying this woman that he said oh, she was a nun and I saved her from Catholicism, right? You got Luther, who's also starting to get kind of off his rocker like a little bit, and he's like actually starting to kind of like really like freak out and go in some weird different directions and saying really mean things about Jewish people. Now the big thing about it though in general is those princes are still clinging to these ideas. Now really quickly though, why, right? Why are they clinging to those ideas? That's exactly right, Stella Merrill. It's the exact same thing that you brought up in class, right? His appeal is growing because the German princes feel like they will gain more power from being Protestant because they won't have to listen to the Catholic leader, Charles V, right? They'll be able to claim some kind of like religious dissension. Now, the big thing about it, though, going into it as well, is you got to also understand that Charles V is a fervent defender of Catholicism, right? He is trying to oust out Luther, arrest him, and then also arrest any of his followers that he can find. Now, going into it, though, the very first large-scale wars that actually break out are actually going to happen in Switzerland, which some of you are like, wait a minute, Switzerland? I thought Switzerland was neutral about everything. This actually is the beginning of that neutrality process, right? Switzerland is going to have its first, it's going to have some wars during the Reformation and then have a handful of like small wars actually going into the 1540s and 1600s. And then following all these different movements and following the Reformation period, Switzerland's going to be like, we're not fighting in wars anymore, right? They literally are going to go with a stance of neutrality forever after that. But the very first wars of violence are going to break out in Switzerland between Protestant and Catholic sects of Swiss government, right? So they were known as the Kappel Wars, right? Or the Keppel Wars is a Swiss civil war that broke out in the Holy Roman Empire because at this time, Switzerland was a part of the Holy Roman Empire between Catholic and Protestant factions. Now, these wars that break out are going to be handfuls of small skirmishes defending cities. Now, in this process, though, you're going to see some of these reformative figures actually participate in them. And in the Kappel Wars, Zwingli died, right? And when Zwingli dies, you're going to see the growth of other Protestant movements in different directions, right? So this is a big thing to understand, is that these wars that are breaking out in Switzerland are just indicative of later wars that are going to be on the horizons as well, right? Charles V, because of this, is going to call another diet, right? So the big thing about it is, let's remember really quickly what a diet is, right? So the thing about a diet, or what a diet is in general, is a diet is just a meeting, okay? Just like we talked about earlier when we talked about like the ideas of the Diet of Worms, right? The Kappel Wars are going to inspire Charles V to have another diet to avoid large-scale war in the Holy Roman Empire because he's freaking out because the first Kappel War happened in 1529. The next diet he calls is called the Diet of Augsburg, which is in 1530, right? So he calls this diet because he wants to try and actually avoid the breakout of large-scale war all over the Holy Roman Empire. He sees the German peasants' revolt happening in 1525. He sees the Kappel Wars in Switzerland happening in 1529. He sees the persecution of Anabaptists that's popping up during this time period as well. And he wants to try and prevent large-scale warfare because large-scale warfare is very, very expensive. Large-scale warfare is well known to kill lots of people and damage the reputation and the strength of an entire area, right? So Charles V, as you can tell, comes into power when he's 19 years old. He's got a very, very chaotic thing going on. So we'll talk about this more when we actually get into absolutism and stuff like that. But the thing about it is when you really look at how much Charles V controlled during this time period, not only, think about this, not only is he dealing with the Reformation, but he's also dealing with the colonies. 1519, is when Cortez strikes out and goes after the Aztecs. A little bit after that, Pizarro is the one that's actually going out and taking over the Inca. Then the encomienda system happens. All that stuff, those are Spanish holdings. Who is Charles V's grandma and grandpa but Isabella and Ferdinand? He controls all Spanish land, right? By this point in history, Charles V, write this down, controls 25% of the globe. 25% of the world, the known world at the time, which is bananas. All right, so like now, in general, though, he calls a diet because he has to avoid large-scale war in Europe so he can focus on the colonies and keep trying to do his best job. Interesting little factor, a lot of historians think that Charles V was a very good leader, but was just in a situation he could never control, right? And so at the Diet of Augsburg, the Lutherans decide to show up to the Diet with a letter or with a document known as the Augsburg Confession, right? So Diet of Augsburg, Augsburg Confession. See how this whole thing works? Now, the big thing about it, though, as well, is a lot of diets have been held in Augsburg for a really long time due to the fact that it's the ancestral home of the Fugger family. Exactly. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, is getting into it, this family has actual very good banking ties to Charles V. They hold the diet in Augsburg. The Lutherans show up with the Augsburg Confession. What this is a document outlining the entirety of the Lutheran faith, right? Outlines the entirety of the Lutheran faith, outlines all the concepts of the Lutheran faith and how it's different distinctly from Catholicism. And it's basically a document that is even still used in the Lutheran Church. And it's issued in 1530 to outline the entire understanding of the faith. Well, Charles V, when he came to the Diet, he had a lot of things to talk about. He wanted to talk about fighting the Ottoman Empire and keeping them out of the Holy Roman Empire. He wanted to talk about trade and trade goods. And then the last thing on the docket was religion. And at this Diet, a big thing happens, okay? He refuses to acknowledge Lutheranism as an official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. He says, I am a fervent Catholic. I am a defender of Catholicism. We are not acknowledging this faith. That means everyone leaves this whole meeting, and in 1531 is when the actual Schmalkaldic League is going to be founded, right? So check this out. When we're looking at the Schmalkaldic League, Schmalkaldic League, there we go. So, I don't know what happened to the picture that I had in there, but it's all of a sudden gone. So the big thing about it, though, in general, is the Schmalkaldic League was founded in 1531, and after this Augsburg Confession meeting, they actually signed the massive document of all these German princes, signified by all these medallions, that they would actually defend their faith and refuse to give it up, and that no matter what Charles V said, that they were going to keep worshiping their ideas, right? Charles V did not realize this because he was dealing with so many other things, but later on, he's going to declare war on them, right? And in 1546, Charles V declares war on the Schmalkaldic League and decides to go out and fight in a large-scale war, even though he was trying the entire time not to do it. Well, the thing about it is, oh, there it is. I actually had it in there the whole time. Weird. Huh, how about that? So the big thing about it, though, getting into it, though, is the Schmalkaldic War is going to end basically in a stalemate, right? The Schmalkaldic War ends without anybody actually really winning one side or the other, and what's going to happen is then Charles V is basically going to just have enough, right? Charles V is devastated. He can't figure out what to do. He doesn't know what else to do, so he decides to call a massive meeting. And at the Peace of Augsburg, one of the biggest meetings that ever happened in European history, he decided to cease military alliances and all wars, and he issued this thing called the Peace of Augsburg. He's like, no more of this war. No more of this stuff. And at this meeting, Lutheranism became a legitimate church, right? And this is also right after this whole thing, the Schmalkaldic War in 1546, interestingly enough, coincides with someone's death. Martin Luther died, right? Martin Luther died 3 months before the Schmalkaldic War ever broke out, right? And Charles V, a lot of historians say that Charles V might have actually used that precedence as a time to actually invade and wage war. But the biggest thing about it in general is that the Schmalkaldic War will wage. Luther is now dead. Lutheranism isn't going anywhere. And so at the Peace of Augsburg, Charles V decides to recognize Lutheranism as a legitimate church, right? And so getting into it as well, or wait, where are we going? There we go. Oh, wait, no. Oh, are we really going to do this right now? Hold on one second. There we go. Sorry about that. Sometimes the president will geek out a little bit. But the biggest thing about oh my God, again? There we go. All right. 2 times, I guess, it's going to take, okay? Now, getting into it, though, all of this fighting is going to eventually lead to the 30 Years' War. But at this meeting, at the Peace of Augsburg, Charles V is going to decide to recognize Lutheranism as a legitimate church. He's also going to do another interesting thing as well. He's going to start splitting his empire, right? Now, the big thing about it in general, though, is that you need to understand that the Peace of Augsburg is going to kind of lead to a little bit of an indicative idea that war is going to be a regular thing in Europe now over religion, right? Now, at the Peace of Augsburg, though, you're going to see Lutheranism recognized as a legitimate church, and the year before it and the year right after it, Charles V is going to start going basically mentally insane. Now remember, his mom was named Joanna the Mad, so of course she probably was a little bit, like bipolar possibly and stuff like that. Now, the very important thing to understand is that in 1554, right before the Peace of Augsburg, which is in 1555, Charles V began a process of splitting the Habsburg family into two distinct branches, an Austrian branch and a Spanish branch. So with that, that's going to start spiraling out of control, and then basically what Charles is going to decide to do is Charles is going to abdicate the throne in 1556. Now this is going to be a major key thing that's going to come up. He's going to go a little bit crazy. He's going to retire to a French monastery because it's quiet and he can sit there and enjoy his time, and he also becomes a raging alcoholic, and he starts showing signs of mental instability. He actually literally apparently, while he abdicated the throne following the Peace of Augsburg and split his family in half and had the Spanish branch on this side and the Austrian branch on this side, all of this is going to lead to a very unstable Europe, just like it led to a very unstable Charles. Charles apparently, while living in this French monastery, would drink all the time, read constantly, and then became obsessed with his own death. He lined the walls of his rooms in this French monastery with clocks that all ticked at the exact same rate, and he would just become obsessed with the idea that he is one day going to die. And as he became so obsessed with his death at one point, he also wondered, would anybody even really care if he died? And so he literally staged his own funeral. And in this process, while he had abdicated the throne, he gave the throne of the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, and then he gave the throne of Spain to his son. And when this whole thing happens, he fakes his death. His son, his brother, come to this fake funeral and all this other stuff. And he was so frustrated with the fact that nobody was upset enough at his funeral that he sat up out of the coffin and then stormed off to his room, where he would then later die a few years later. The whole thing about it in general, though, is Charles V obviously is off his rocker, but we'll come back to that stuff here in a little bit. But now what we're going to do is we're going to be jumping backwards into England. We're going to go over to England and we're going to start talking about the English Reformation under this guy, Henry VIII. But we're going to talk about this dude in class because you got to talk about Henry VIII in class. But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.